In the winter of 1899, a single photograph emerged from the shadows of forgotten archives, carrying with it a mystery that would haunt medical historians for generations. The image was an X-ray, crisp and clear despite its age, showing the delicate bone structure of what appeared to be a small human frame. But there was something deeply unsettling about this particular piece of early radiographic history. The institutional record attached to the photograph contained no patient name, no family contact, no admission date. Instead, scrawled across the bottom in faded ink, were just two words: Specimen 12. The discovery came about almost by accident, the kind of fortunate stumble that defines archival work. Royal, a meticulous archivist with nearly 2 decades of experience cataloging medical documents, had been tasked with organizing the restricted vault of the Institute of Medical History. The vault itself was a cramped, musty space filled with leather-bound ledgers and deteriorating file boxes, materials that had been sealed away for reasons lost to time. Royal had developed a methodical approach to such work, treating each document with the respect it deserved while maintaining the emotional distance necessary for objectivity. But when the X-ray plate slipped from a bundle of papers belonging to Kameron, the former laboratory director, Royal felt an immediate chill of recognition. This was not just another forgotten medical record. This was something far more troubling. The X-ray technology itself was still remarkably new in 1899. Just 4 years earlier, Malik, a pioneering physicist, had accidentally discovered the mysterious rays while experimenting with cathode tubes in his laboratory. The medical community had seized upon this revelation with an enthusiasm that bordered on recklessness. Suddenly, doctors could peer inside the living body without making a single incision. It was miraculous, revolutionary, and almost entirely unregulated. The early X-ray facilities operated in a gray zone of medical ethics, where the boundary between research and exploitation remained dangerously unclear. Patients often had no understanding of what was being done to them, and consent was rarely more than an afterthought. The Institute of Medical History Annex, where this particular X-ray had been taken, occupied a peculiar position in the landscape of turn-of-the-century medicine. Under the direction of Kameron, it had gained a reputation as both a center of innovation and a place where uncomfortable questions were quietly discouraged. Kameron himself was a complex figure, respected for his administrative efficiency but whispered about in professional circles for his willingness to push ethical boundaries in the name of scientific progress. The facility attracted ambitious researchers who saw in the new radiographic technology an opportunity to make their mark on medical history. What made the Specimen 12 photograph particularly disturbing was not just the anonymity of the subject, but the meticulous care evident in every other aspect of the record-keeping. The X-ray plate bore professional markings that indicated precise attention to detail. The date was clearly noted, along with the exposure time and technical specifications. Yet, where a patient's name should have appeared, there was only that clinical, dehumanizing designation. The contradiction was stark and deeply troubling. This was not a case of sloppy record-keeping or bureaucratic oversight. Someone had made a deliberate choice to erase this person's identity. Royal's initial investigation revealed an even more puzzling absence. The Institute of Medical History maintained comprehensive patient logs, a practice that Kameron had insisted upon as a matter of professional pride. Every individual who passed through the facility, whether for treatment or research purposes, was supposed to be documented with full biographical details. Royal spent days cross-referencing the date of the X-ray with the official admission records, searching for any entry that might correspond to Specimen 12. The logs from that period were intact and appeared complete. There were entries before the date in question and entries after. But for the subject of this particular X-ray, there was simply nothing. It was as if the person had never existed in any official capacity. The mystery deepened when Royal consulted with Elijah, a dedicated record-keeper who had maintained the Institute's documentation system for nearly 3 decades. Elijah's reputation for precision was legendary. Colleagues joked that he could recall the details of files he had processed years earlier with perfect accuracy. When Royal presented him with the Specimen 12 photograph and asked about the missing logbook entry, Elijah's reaction was immediate and visceral. His face drained of color as he examined the X-ray plate. This was not merely unusual, he explained. It was a fundamental breach of protocol, the kind of deviation that could only occur through deliberate action. Clerical errors were one thing, easily explained and corrected, but a gap this specific, this targeted, suggested something far more sinister. Someone had intentionally removed this person from the official record. The investigation that followed would consume the better part of a year and involve a small team of researchers committed to uncovering the truth. Kane, a documentary filmmaker with a background in investigative journalism, became interested in the case after Royal reached out to local media about the discovery. Kane saw in the Specimen 12 mystery a powerful story about the hidden costs of scientific progress. He assembled a research team that included Dalton, a medical historian specializing in the ethics of early radiology, and Lewis, an expert in turn-of-the-century institutional practices. Together, they began the painstaking work of reconstructing the circumstances surrounding the mysterious X-ray. Dalton's research into the historical context proved essential for understanding the environment in which Specimen 12 had been photographed. The late 1890s represented a particularly dark chapter in medical ethics. The concept of informed consent barely existed, especially when it came to research subjects drawn from marginalized populations. Poor immigrants, institutionalized individuals, and those deemed socially undesirable were routinely used in medical experiments without their knowledge or permission. The medical establishment operated under the assumption that the potential benefits to science justified almost any means of obtaining data. It was a utilitarian calculus that placed collective progress above individual dignity. Within this broader context, the specific operations of Kameron's facility took on a more ominous character. Lewis uncovered documents suggesting that the Institute of Medical History Annex had been involved in several controversial research projects during the 1890s. While nothing in the official records explicitly confirmed unethical practices, there were hints and suggestions that painted a troubling picture. Budget allocations for projects that were never formally documented. Gaps in the personnel schedules that coincided with periods of intensive experimental work. A pattern of marginalized patients being admitted for treatment and then disappearing from the records entirely. As the research team dug deeper, 3 primary theories emerged about the identity of Specimen 12. Each theory was supported by fragmentary evidence and historical precedent, yet none could be definitively proven. The first theory, championed by Dalton, suggested that Specimen 12 had been an undocumented patient from a marginalized community. Perhaps someone poor, likely an immigrant whose impending death made them a convenient subject for experimental radiology. The X-ray would have been taken as a final record, a way to capture data from a dying person who had no family to advocate for them and no social standing to protect them. The erasure of their name would have been a calculated decision to avoid potential legal complications. If the family never knew about the X-ray, they could never file a complaint or seek damages. Dalton found compelling parallels in other cases from the same era. Archives from hospitals in major cities contained occasional references to experimental procedures performed on patients identified only by number or designation. In some instances, these were individuals who had been admitted under false pretenses, promised free medical care in exchange for participating in research they did not fully understand. When complications arose or when patients died as a result of experimental procedures, their identities would sometimes be obscured in the official records. It was a form of institutional self-protection, a way to advance medical knowledge while minimizing accountability for the human cost. The second theory took a different approach. Lewis proposed that Specimen 12 might have been the subject of an unauthorized experiment conducted by a junior staff member operating outside the official chain of command. Anya, a young radiography apprentice who had worked at the facility during the relevant period, emerged as a potential candidate. Anya's personnel file revealed an ambitious technician who had repeatedly requested permission to conduct independent research projects. Her superiors, including Kameron, had consistently denied these requests, citing concerns about proper supervision and ethical oversight. But what if Anya had proceeded anyway, using her access to the X-ray equipment to conduct clandestine experiments on vulnerable subjects? This theory gained some support from the technical characteristics of the X-ray itself. Several experts who examined the photograph noted subtle differences in technique compared to other X-rays produced at the facility during the same period. The exposure time was longer than standard protocol recommended, suggesting either inexperience or a deliberate attempt to capture more detailed images despite the increased radiation exposure to the subject. The angle of the shot was also unusual, not matching the typical positioning used for diagnostic purposes. It looked more like an exploratory image, the kind of photograph someone might take while learning the limits of the new technology. The third theory was perhaps the most disturbing. Layton, a researcher specializing in missing persons cases from the late 19th century, discovered that a local child had disappeared in the autumn of 1899, just weeks before the date stamped on the Specimen 12 X-ray. The child, whose family had reported the disappearance to local authorities, had never been found. The physical characteristics visible in the X-ray, particularly the small frame and underdeveloped bone structure, were consistent with a child of approximately the same age as the missing person. Could Specimen 12 have been a clandestine attempt to identify unknown remains? This theory opened up dark possibilities. If the X-ray had been taken as part of a police investigation, why would it have been hidden in the archives of a medical research facility rather than filed with law enforcement records? Why would the subject have been assigned a specimen number rather than being treated as a potential victim of crime? Layton hypothesized that the X-ray might have been part of an unofficial investigation, perhaps conducted by someone at the Institute who had access to the technology and wanted to help identify the remains without drawing official attention to how those remains had been obtained or examined. As these theories circulated among the research team, Royal made another crucial discovery. While cataloging additional materials from Kameron's personal papers, Royal found a smaller, privately maintained ledger that had been tucked inside a hollowed-out medical textbook. This ledger, clearly intended to be kept secret, contained cryptic references to something called Project Sigma. The entries were sparse and written in a kind of shorthand that suggested the author expected no one else to ever read them. But there, on a page dated just days before the Specimen 12 X-ray, was a reference to an experimental imaging protocol and a note about securing a suitable subject. The existence of this secret ledger transformed the investigation. It provided direct evidence that Kameron had been involved in undocumented research projects, work that he had deliberately concealed from official oversight. Kane's team began looking for additional gaps in the official record, anomalies that might indicate other instances of unethical research. What they found was a pattern of irregularities clustered around the same time period. Attendance logs for Malik, the lead radiologist who had pioneered many of the facility's imaging techniques, showed an unexplained 2-week absence immediately following the date of the Specimen 12 X-ray. The absence was marked only as personal business, a vague designation that violated the Institute's normally strict standards for documenting staff whereabouts. Olivia, the team's financial researcher, uncovered another troubling detail. Budget records for the Institute of Medical History showed a substantial cash withdrawal on the exact date of the Specimen 12 X-ray. The withdrawal, which amounted to several months' worth of an average worker's salary, had been authorized by Kameron personally. But there was no corresponding documentation explaining what the money had been used for. No equipment purchases, no consultant fees, no legitimate expense that could account for such a large and unusual transaction. The implication was clear. Someone had been paid for something that needed to remain off the books. The evidence was mounting toward an unmistakable conclusion. The Specimen 12 X-ray was not the result of a clerical error or a minor procedural oversight. It was part of a deliberate cover-up, an organized effort to conceal the circumstances surrounding an unethical or potentially criminal act. But what had actually happened to the subject of the X-ray, and who was ultimately responsible? The research team found themselves confronting not just a historical mystery, but a moral question about how to interpret incomplete evidence and fragmentary records. The climax of the investigation came when Harley, a legal historian examining professional disciplinary records, discovered that Malik had left the Institute of Medical History abruptly just months after the Specimen 12 X-ray was taken. The official explanation given at the time was poor health, a common euphemism for a variety of career-ending situations. But Harley's research suggested a different story. Cross-referencing Malik's departure with medical licensing records and professional correspondence, Harley found hints of a scandal that had been quietly contained. There were references in private letters to a serious error in judgment, to professional disgrace narrowly avoided, to a reputation permanently damaged despite the absence of formal charges. The theory that emerged from this evidence was both logical and deeply troubling. Malik had likely been involved in the Specimen 12 incident, possibly as the radiologist who actually took the X-ray. When the nature of the experiment became known to Kameron, perhaps through the discovery of unauthorized use of equipment or through questions raised by other staff members, a decision had been made. Rather than allow the scandal to become public and potentially destroy the Institute's reputation, the evidence would be buried and Malik would be quietly forced out. His career would be sacrificed to protect the institution. The cash withdrawal might have been a payoff, either to Malik himself to ensure his silence, or to someone else who needed to be compensated or persuaded to look the other way. This interpretation gained additional support from a final, haunting piece of evidence. Charlie, a paleographer skilled in reading historical handwriting, was examining Kameron's private ledger when she noticed a faint notation on one of the final pages. The entry had been made years after the Specimen 12 incident, shortly before Kameron's death. The handwriting was shaky, the words barely legible, but the message was clear enough. Debt paid in full, it read, followed by a single initial, S. The notation suggested a burden carried for decades, a secret that had weighed on Kameron's conscience until the end of his life. But as the research team compiled their findings and prepared to present their conclusions, they began to recognize that the mystery of Specimen 12 could not be resolved in any conventional sense. The identity of the person in the X-ray would almost certainly never be known. Too much time had passed, too many records had been destroyed or lost, too many witnesses had died, taking their secrets with them. What remained was not a solution, but an interpretation, a way of understanding what the evidence suggested about the hidden costs of scientific progress. Alyssa, the team's medical ethicist, argued for a reframing of the entire investigation. The real story of Specimen 12, she suggested, was not about solving the mystery of who this person was, but about recognizing what their anonymity represented. The erasure of identity was not just a cover-up tactic. It was emblematic of how early medical science viewed certain categories of people. To be reduced to a specimen number was to be stripped of humanity, to be transformed from a person into an object of study. The fact that this particular X-ray had survived, that it had been preserved even as the identity of its subject was erased, made it a powerful historical document. It was physical evidence of an injustice, a reminder that medical progress had been built in part on the bodies of people whose consent was never sought and whose suffering was never acknowledged. Colette, a museum curator who had been consulting with the team about the proper preservation and display of the X-ray, pointed out that Specimen 12 now belonged to a category of historical artifacts that carried both evidential and memorial significance. Like the remains of enslaved people discovered at archaeological sites or the medical specimens collected from institutionalized patients without consent, the X-ray served as testimony to historical wrongs that might otherwise be forgotten. The challenge was how to present such material to the public in a way that honored the dignity of the unknown subject while also educating viewers about the ethical evolution of medical practice. The research team's final report, published after more than a year of investigation, carefully laid out the evidence they had gathered and the conclusions they could responsibly draw. The X-ray was authentic, dating definitively to 1899 based on both the chemical composition of the plate and the historical context of the facility where it had been produced. The subject had been intentionally de-identified, assigned the designation Specimen 12 as part of what appeared to be a systematic effort to conceal the circumstances of the imaging. The cover-up had been expensive, both financially and professionally, ending or damaging the careers of at least one and possibly several individuals connected to the incident. And finally, the X-ray now stood as a primary source document for understanding the ethical failures of early radiology, a field that had advanced rapidly in technical capability while lagging dangerously behind in moral responsibility. In the years following the investigation, the Specimen 12 X-ray became a focal point for discussions about medical ethics and historical accountability. Medical schools began using it as a teaching tool, a way to illustrate to future doctors the importance of informed consent and patient dignity. Ethicists cited it in debates about how to handle historical injustices in scientific research, and historians incorporated it into broader narratives about the human cost of technological progress. The ways in which innovation often advances unevenly, bringing benefits to some while inflicting harm on others. For Royal, the archivist who had first discovered the X-ray in that forgotten vault, the experience had been transformative. What had begun as routine cataloging work had evolved into a confrontation with uncomfortable historical truths. The archive, Royal came to understand, was not just a repository of information, but a site of ongoing ethical engagement. Every document preserved carried within it the traces of human decisions, human suffering, human dignity asserted or denied. The work of an archivist was not merely technical, but fundamentally moral, requiring constant attention to whose stories were being told and whose were being erased. Specimen 12 remained nameless, their identity lost to time and deliberate obscuring. But through the investigation, through the careful documentation of evidence and the thoughtful interpretation of fragmentary records, something of their humanity had been restored. They were no longer just an anonymous specimen, a number in a forgotten ledger. They had become a symbol, a reminder that behind every scientific advancement lies a human story, and that progress without ethics is not progress at all, but exploitation dressed in the language of knowledge. The X-ray photograph, once hidden away in a restricted vault, now served a purpose its creators could never have intended. It bore witness to an injustice, ensured that the forgotten would not remain completely forgotten, and challenged each new generation to do better than those who had come before.